I'm Doug Fern, and this is my take on music recording. For many musicians, recording in a professional studio can be an overwhelming experience at first. There's a lot going on, it's all very technical, and mostly incomprehensible. Jargon is thrown around. Things often move fast. For a while, I've been thinking about doing an episode that explains, in the simplest terms, the recording process for musicians. Some musicians are very technically adept, probably because they have learned to do their own recording at home. But some may have misconceptions or otherwise might benefit from a better understanding of the technology. Others don't really want to know. They want to focus all their energy on the music and performance in the studio and leave all the dull technical stuff to others. But I suspect that most musicians would like to know more about what is going on around them. This episode is for them, although I suspect that even seasoned studio players might find some useful tidbits. For most people, the more you understand, the better you can use the technology of the studio. That makes better recorded music. The studio is a highly technical place for sure, but music has always been dependent on technology, even long before there was recorded sound. Just study how a piano works to see how complex our instruments can be. Even simple instruments like a flute are pretty technically complex, partly to make them easier to play, but also to provide a beautiful and consistent sound. You don't have to be a mechanical engineer to play an instrument, but it does help you play better if you have some insight into how your instrument works. And it helps to understand the technology of the studio if you want to use its capabilities to the fullest. I could pile layers of electronic and acoustic theory on you, but I will try not to. In fact, I have a rule when explaining anything. Never tell them more than 1/3 of what you know about a subject. In this episode, it will be far less than 1/3. I'll try to keep the science and technology to the bare minimum necessary to understand the principles involved. For those of you who understand these things more deeply, bear with me and try not to yell out, "That's not really accurate." This is going to be just enough information to be helpful and no more. To help me avoid wandering off into excessive detail, I have asked Corrie Lynn Green to participate in this. It will be a conversation, and Corrie has agreed to tell me when something isn't clear or if I am getting too far into the weeds with my explanations. You may remember Corrie from a highly popular episode from December 2021 called A Recording Deconstructed. In that one, I used one of Corrie's songs from demo to finished version to illustrate the process I used to produce and record her song, Angel's Teeth. Corrie is quite new to recording. We have been working together since the fall of 2020 and really have only done a few sessions together. Those sessions were her introduction to studio technology. Because of time constraints, our sessions are hectic as we try to get as many songs done in a day as we can. That leaves me little time to explain why I'm doing something and how it affects the final product. Corrie is a singer-songwriter from rural Virginia and writes modern Appalachian songs based on her life experiences. Her instrument is the banjo. And I should mention, Corrie is my first female guest on this podcast. Try as I might, over the past 2 years since I started this podcast, I have not been able to get a female guest on this podcast until now. So, Corrie, welcome, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to say a little more about yourself before we get started?
So I am Corrie Lynn Green, and I write songs about where I'm from and am expanding on that. I live right outside of the Shenandoah National Park in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and grew up listening to all kinds of music, but grew up in a bluegrass family, so I'm heavily influenced by that style.
You know, you actually did have one recording session before you came here in a real studio.
True.
Can you tell us about that experience?
Yes, that was a sort of frightening experience for me. I had won a raffle to have a free 4-hour recording session in a studio called Blue Sprocket Sound, which is a local recording studio in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I was working with a sound engineer named Gordon Davies. And I had written a couple of songs, but I didn't have any experience recording at all. And in fact, had never even sang into a microphone at that point. And I went in just for fun to get some of the songs recorded and down just for my own pleasure. And I was pretty nervous and was overwhelmed by the studio setting and just had never experienced anything like that before. And I went in and immediately sat down at some recording equipment and microphones and tried to both sing and play the banjo at the same time with others. And I found it really challenging. Eventually, he split my playing and my singing. He separated me. I would sing in a booth and I would just play into a microphone elsewhere. And that seemed to help sort of settle my nerves and get me used to the process a little bit.
Okay, well, you mentioned microphones, which is actually our first topic here, because microphones are what musicians in the studio, that's the thing right in front of them, or right in front of their instrument. And so that's the piece of technology that they're first exposed to. I'd like to know from your perspective, what does a microphone do?
Initially, in that first experience of recording, I really had no idea and didn't even really process the microphone that was in front of me until I got to your studio. In my mind, a microphone is there to pick up the sounds of my voice and the sounds of my voice recording, make it come through the computer and sound. Well, I guess it doesn't actually affect anything in the way that you mix it, but to bring it through so that you can hear it recorded over other sounds like my instrument.
Mm-hmm. I think that's pretty good. You know, in that first session, we just did demos. We were just sort of getting some of your songs down to think about.
Yeah.
And the first microphone that I picked to use on your voice was the same one we're using today, which is an AEA R44, which is exact duplicate of the original RCA 44 from 1930. And still one of my very most favorite microphones. I use them a lot. But that day, we also tried a couple of other ones. And after I had you do a little bit into each microphone, we went into the control room and listened to them back. And what was your impression when you heard those coming back?
Yeah, that was really interesting. And I did a lot of learning, I think, listening back. The microphone that we're using today and that we gravitate toward generally now for my voice seem to pick up the subtleness of it, the gravelly parts, and it really sounded like me mellowed out in many ways. Some of the other microphones that we used, I sounded brassier. I sounded a little wilder around the edges. I don't know if that's a great description, but it just wasn't as clean and clear and soft in a way.
Right. I think that's a really good description. By the way, the other two microphones we used were a different type. And I think it's helpful to people to understand the types of microphones that are used in the studio and their characteristics and why you might pick one over the other. So I'm just going to go through the three main types that you'll find in the studio and just give some of their broad characteristics so that people get a sense of how they sound, the differences between them. So if you see a photo of a recording session or a video, or if you're even there observing it, or even the performer, most of the microphones you'll see are what are called condenser microphones. They're characterized, generally speaking, by being a fairly large cylinder, and they're usually surrounded by this sort of complex-looking spider web of elastic things that isolate the microphone from vibration. And so that's, I think, what most people think of when they think of recording in a studio. Condenser mics are the most popular mics used in recording. And for good reason, because they do sound very, very good. And a particularly good sound, and a lot of times with music that requires the vocal to compete with a lot of noisy instruments. I don't say it in a negative way, but
Right.
I mean, just instruments that have a lot of density to them to get the vocal to cut through. And one of the characteristics of the majority of condenser mics is that they have a rising high-frequency response, which means it would be as if you turned up the treble control on that microphone. And by doing that, it allows the voice to be mixed farther down into all the instruments and still be heard. So they're very good at that. So that's one of the reasons that they're so popular in the studio, because for a lot of music, that's the obvious choice because you need that characteristic. But no microphone's perfect. I mean, they're far from perfect. And they all have some deviation from a reality that could be seen as a deficiency or it could be seen as a tool to use.
Something that occurred to me when we were choosing microphones was it would just depend on a person's style of singing or their voice in general. So all microphones could be good depending on the vocalist.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Okay, condenser mics also tend to be pretty versatile because most of them, they have adjustments right on the microphone that affect how they pick up sound and just how the sound is conveyed. So that's a good reason why they're so popular. On your sessions, we use almost all ribbon microphones, which I'll talk about in a minute, but we do use condenser microphones in some cases. But the next one I want to talk about is called a dynamic microphone. And this is a type of microphone that you usually see on stage. And for good reason, because they tend to be smaller, because the other studio microphones are pretty big. I mean, like right now with this microphone in between us, I can't even really see you.
Yes.
And but the dynamic microphones can be made quite small. They're also very rugged. You know, they can take getting dropped over and over and over again, and they'll just keep working. You can't do that with a studio microphone. One drop and it's thousands of dollars repair.
Oh, wow.
And the other nice thing about the dynamic mics is that they're relatively inexpensive, and they can sound great. I mean, look at or listen to albums that were recorded live, like particularly in the 1970s and 80s, and all that you hear there are dynamic microphones that were used for the performance that they just split off and recorded separately. Mm-hmm. So they can sound great, but compared to a condenser microphone, you know, they're a little bit lacking in terms of their ability to capture all the sounds and subtleties in the voice or whatever instrument. So they're not often used in the studio. There are exceptions. There are a couple of really good dynamic mics that, you know, are sometimes the perfect choice. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, most studios will automatically put up a condenser mic.
Is a condenser mic the kind of mic that stands on its own and you really only need one and it picks up all the instruments and the voice? That's the way I've typically used one when I haven't been in the studio. It's been one solid microphone for everyone.
Right. Well, you can do that with any microphone.
Okay.
It just happens that most people use condenser microphones just because they're the most popular.
Okay.
But the third category is like what we're using today, which is called a ribbon microphone, which describes internally how it works, which I'm not going to get into. But the amazing thing to me is the original version of this mic we're using right now, which was designed by RCA in the late 1920s and introduced as a product in the early 1930s, was really the first high-quality microphone that ever existed on Earth. And, what are the chances of that microphone still being the favorite for so many people on so many sounds? It's just amazing to me. It just really shows how the engineers at RCA just really wanted to make this microphone sound good in a wide variety of situations. Those are my favorite kinds of microphones. They're extremely clean sounding and very natural sounding. Mm-hmm. To my ear, when I hear condenser microphones, I always hear distortion. Most of the time, that's not an issue because the music doesn't require perfectly pristine audio, and the other characteristics of those mics make it a good choice. But it bothers me. Mm-hmm. So, I've used condenser mics on vocals for decades, but whenever possible, I prefer the sound of a ribbon microphone like this. Ribbon microphones sort of went through a period of time when nobody wanted that old technology. When condenser mics became readily available, after World War II, all the ribbon mics went into a cabinet somewhere and nobody ever used them again. But they've had a renaissance in the last 20 or 30 years where people are starting to appreciate their characteristics again. And I use a ribbon microphone on your banjo because of the banjo. How do you describe that sound?
So it's really loud, number one. I use a bluegrass banjo, which has a resonator on the back of it. So the sound really carries and it's really loud. And it's pretty brashy. I tend not to play it as loudly and brashy as you can, but it still just has that sound, a twang, and it really rings out.
Yeah. The initial plucking of the strings, that initial sound is very sharp.
Sharp, yes.
Yeah. And that can get on your nerves, especially right. If you put a condenser mic on there, which boosts that characteristic even more.
Yeah.
But the ribbon mic seems to be a really good complement to that instrument.
Yeah, it softens it down a bit.
Right. But yet it doesn't lose any of the fullness of the sound. Mm-hmm. The banjo is very challenging to record.
Yes, and it has its reputation as being that one of the hardest instruments to record. And I think as a player, I try to acknowledge that when I'm on stage with other people as well, not to overpower anyone.
It can make a whole lot of noise for such a little instrument.
It sure can.
Yeah, I'm sure it is the loudest of any stringed instrument.
That might be true.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked about the three main types of microphones. Do you think that gives you better insight into that? Is there anything that you're curious about that I didn't mention?
Well, you said we weren't going to get too far into how the ribbon technology works, but I definitely, now that we've worked together so much, know that that's how I like to hear my voice the best when we go back and listen. And also, this RCA ribbon microphone is beautiful. There's something really classic about it, something very, like you've seen it before, but it's old but new. And so there's something really visually appealing about this particular microphone as well.
Yeah, I agree. Aesthetically, I think it's really well done, but it's all form follows function.
Yes.
I know quite a bit about how that microphone was designed, and although I do agree that it aesthetically is just very attention-grabbing.
Yes.
Every bit of it was to make it sound the proper way.
Yeah, it's a great microphone.
Yeah. Any other questions about that aspect of microphones?
No,
types?
I think that was a good explanation.
Okay, good. Now, the next characteristic, and this is the only other thing that I'm going to talk about with microphones, is how they pick up sound coming from various directions. You might think that the ideal microphone would only pick up sound directly in front of it. And that's what is generally termed a unidirectional microphone, one direction. It's also sometimes called a cardioid pattern because it's kind of a heart-shaped pattern. Mm-hmm. And that's the pattern that's used most frequently in recording. The majority of times when you see somebody recording, they're singing into or playing into a condenser microphone in that cardioid pattern. And the idea is that it rejects the sound from all other directions except what's directly in front of it. But nothing's perfect. So that's not really the whole story, because what happens when you make a microphone directional, generally speaking, it really only has that classic pattern in the mid-range of frequencies, which is good because that's where voices are and where most instruments are with their fundamental tones. Mm-hmm. But as you go up higher, and there's, even though our voices are centered, 200 to 600 hertz, or, roughly around the middle C of a piano, that kind of range, there's components of the sound that go much higher and much lower than that. And if you don't have them there, it doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound natural. Mm-hmm. So you have to have that extended frequency response, which all good design microphones do to the best of their ability. Now, the funny thing that happens with most directional microphones is that as you get farther and farther from those middle range tones, the pattern changes and it becomes less and less directional. So in a situation where you have, well, let's use the example of if you're singing and playing banjo at the same time. It may be that if we used a cardioid microphone on your vocal, the off axis where the sound from the banjo is coming from might have a lot more high frequency content than it should. Mm-hmm. And that could be a real problem.
Yes.
And that's a real problem with drums too.
Right.
And at the opposite extreme, if you're in a room with a bunch of other instruments, let's say there's an upright bass player, and your unidirectional cardioid microphone is supposed to be rejecting as much as possible the sound from that upright bass, but it may not have the directional characteristics you expect at those low frequencies. So you hear a lot more of the bass in the vocal mic than you might expect. That's one deficiency of the directional microphone. And another is that the sound of the microphone, as you move off of that directly on-axis sound, changes dramatically. So with most microphones. So the frequency response, how the highs and lows and mids are all balanced, changes as you get farther and farther off of the microphone. Well, that's fine if it's just one source of sound and that's all there is going on. But if there are other instruments that are off to the side of that microphone or in back of that microphone, but still being picked up somewhat by that microphone, they're not going to sound good.
Right.
They're going to sound weird. And that's can be a real problem. That's another one of the reasons why I like ribbon microphones, which are natively in the bidirectional characteristic, which means they pick up sound equally from in front of them and in back of them.
Okay.
The bidirectional pattern, which is sometimes called a figure-8 pattern because it sort of describes, the way it picks up on the front and back,
sure,
but not off the sides. And if you picture a figure-8, you notice that where the lines cross in the middle, it's tiny. I mean, They just cross in one point, really.
Right.
And the same thing happens with these microphones. So what it means is that the sound off the side of the microphone is attenuated, dropped in level incredibly low. So they reject sound off the side. And it's not just the left and right side, but it's top and bottom too. It's like a disc around the microphone. Now, that can be very useful in isolating different instruments because you can set it up so that you place what's called the null on the side of the microphone towards the sound you want to reject.
Okay, right.
Right. And we can actually illustrate that right now on this microphone because I'm just going to turn it 90 degrees. So we'll both be talking into the sides of it. Okay. So now, do you hear anything?
Yeah, I can't even hear myself.
No, in the headphones it's gone, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
That's pretty neat.
Yeah. So what's left is what we can hear is just the sound of the room.
Right. Wow. That's a cool experiment.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to turn it back. Okay, here we are back in front and back of it again. So you can see how valuable that can be.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why when we're recording your vocal and banjo at the same time, which we did on some of the songs that you did by yourself on the album.
Yes.
And, I wanted to keep it more of a performance sound rather than replacing those parts. I used bidirectional microphones so that I could set it up so that your vocal mic rejected the sound of the banjo, and a banjo mic rejected the sound of your voice.
Right.
And that way I had better control over the two of them, and they didn't have this weird kind of distant sound on one mic, that would be bleeding into the overall combination. To me, that's the ideal pattern.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. But it does have the disadvantage that you have to be careful how you place it because you could have something off the back of that microphone that you're picking up. In other words, let's give an example. When we were recording the tracks for your album, we had drums, acoustic guitar, and cello all in the same room where we are right now. Mm-hmm. And it's a small room, and they were pretty close together. So for Peter's cello part, I used a microphone, one of these 44s, because I really like that microphone on cello. And I aimed it so that the side of it was pointing towards the drums. So it minimized the pickup of the drums into the cello mic.
Yeah, and another example would be something even simpler. Before I really knew how to sing straight onto a microphone because I was a performer, I was always moving my head from side to side, which would impact the sound and create less sound on each side when I would move. So I had to learn to sing straight on.
Right. Yeah, it's a different technique. And actually, I'm going to mention that. Sorry. Not a problem. But just to finish our directional patterns, the third major pickup pattern of a microphone is called omnidirectional. What does that suggest to you? What does that mean that microphone does?
So that it would take direction from all sides.
Right. It would pick up sound equally from coming from any direction, which you might say, well, that's not helpful. But sometimes it is, because supposing you want to record 4 or 5 background singers all at once, and they are able to balance themselves. Instead of using individual mics, you could put one omnidirectional microphone in the middle, and they could sing into that and do their own balance, and then you just have one really nice, solid track for the background vocals. The other time it's useful is if you want a lot of the room sound in a recording. I don't tend to do this much because this room is too small to have a nice sound. But a lot of times you'll use omnidirectional microphones way out far from the sound source that you can use to blend in with the sound from the close mics. And that can provide a much better sense of the space so that it sounds like it's coming from a real an actual room rather than just sort of this highly isolated sound. Because no matter what we do, we're always hear some of the room in the microphone. And you can adjust that various ways by being farther or closer or by using different directional patterns. And another application would be, and I use this sometimes for drums, to get a lot of room sound on the drums, but I don't want the room mics to pick up a lot of the direct sound of the mics. So rather than use an omnidirectional mic, I end up using a bidirectional mic, just like this, and aiming that null side pickup at the drum set.
Oh.
So all you hear, mostly anyway, is the sound of the room. You hear the sound of the drums echoing around the room.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I actually did some of that on Kate's harmony parts when we had multiple tracks of her.
Yeah.
So to give it, some depth to it. So it sounded like there was one of her right up next to you.
Yes.
And then a couple of other, or 3 or 4 of her sort of arrayed in back of you.
Very cool.
Yeah. And some microphones, you can actually adjust the pattern. That's very common on condenser microphones, which makes them really versatile. So you have a switch that's either on the microphone itself or on a separate control box that you can select either unidirectional cardioid, bidirectional, like a ribbon mic, or omnidirectional.
Okay.
That makes those mics very versatile.
Yes.
Now, what I discovered, I don't want to say how many years ago, was that I really preferred the sound of my condenser mics in the bidirectional position.
Oh, wow.
And that's the way I always used them, even though it meant that I might pick up some more of the room or other instruments or whatever. But if it was just a vocal all by itself, I just liked that sound. Of course, everybody's different. It's
right.
It's like you can't make any rule that applies to everybody in all recording situations.
Right. It's just what your ears.
Right. And that's part of the style of the person doing the recording.
Yeah.
How they envision all those pieces fitting together.
Right.
One more thing about microphones, and that's what I'm going to just generally term microphone technique.
Okay.
Which you alluded to a minute ago about how you had to learn to stay pretty much in the same spot when you were singing.
Yes.
So there's several characteristics of the mics, and you just talked about one where, especially with a directional mic, but it applies to any mic, as you get off of being directly in front of it, the level drops and the character of the sound changes too. And the ratio between the direct sound of your voice and the sound of your voice echoing in the room changes.
Yes.
So that's one of the reasons why it's important to be at a consistent distance from the microphone. It's interesting that you don't always have to sing or talk right into the microphone. You can set the microphone so it's at a slight angle, but it's still aimed at your mouth.
Yeah.
So that sometimes that can be helpful if you have songs that have a lot of P's in them. You don't want to pop the P's. You don't have that problem. You're really good about avoiding that.
Yes.
But for some people, that's challenging.
Yeah.
And in those cases, you can tilt the microphone a little bit, and you're still aimed at their mouth, but it's not directly at their mouth.
Right.
Another characteristic of almost all directional microphones is what's called proximity effect, which is a fancy engineering term explaining how the sound of the microphone gets more bassy the closer you get to it.
Right.
Oftentimes that's a problem because it gets too bassy.
Right.
For example, on the recording we're doing today, I have my standard bass roll-off on an equalizer on this microphone just to compensate for that because we're pretty close to it.
Yeah.
If we didn't do that, it would be boomy and kind of annoying sounding.
Okay.
But you can, even with that equalizer in there,
Yeah.
if you try this, I want you to, everybody knows what you sound like now from that distance, which is what, a
Right.
foot away, maybe
Yes.
14 inches.
Yes.
And why don't you go to half that distance and talk a little bit?
Okay, this is what I sound like now. I'm
Okay.
about half the distance closer.
Okay, now move half again closer.
Now I'm a lot closer.
Yeah.
I can even hear it in my own earphones.
Right. Now, obviously, it gets louder, but it also, there's more bass in your voice.
Yeah.
And we can use that effect. Experienced singers can use that proximity effect. So if they have a song that, has a wide dynamic range and they have parts of it where they're really singing out and projecting, and there's intimate parts where they want to get right into the listener's ear, they can use that proximity effect. You have to coordinate with the engineer and see if it all works properly.
Yeah.
But, it can be a really useful effect so that you can get right up on it. Now, when you do that with most microphones, they become really sensitive to all kinds of sounds that we really don't want to hear.
Right.
Not only the P's popping, but the sibilance of the S sounds gets exaggerated.
Yeah.
So it's not something you can do all the time. And I think a lot of people make that mistake. They think that, it's like on stage when you're singing into an SM58, which is a standard kind of microphone on stage. You have to be really close to it. Practically your lips have to be on that microphone.
Yes.
That's just the way they're designed to work, which is perfect for performing. But if you try to do that with a studio microphone, it can be really annoying sounding because every little click and pop in your mouth and your lips, all those things just get picked up. And in some music, that'll get buried and it's not important. But in other kinds of music, it can be really distracting.
In some ways, it sounds like it's possibly healthier to sing into a studio microphone because you're not having to strain or push quite as hard. It's picking all that up in an easier way than on stage.
Right. Yeah. Well, you can be a lot more relaxed for sure. If, your engineer or producer chooses a particular microphone for your vocal, and then they discover that you're popping the P's on it, there's some things that they can do to mitigate that. I mean, the easiest one is just say, back off.
Yes.
But if you still want to have that kind of intimacy and not pop the P's, sometimes what they'll do is they'll put a metal or fabric screen in between. I don't like doing that because I don't like the way it changes the sound. But that's one very common way of minimizing those pops and other mouth sounds.
Yeah, you see that all the time.
I know. A lot of people just automatically set it up that way, which, that's the sound they're getting. If they like that sound, that's fine. I'm not going to argue with that.
But you think it does interrupt the sound in some way?
Yeah, I think it degrades the sound slightly.
Slightly.
But enough that I prefer not to use that if I don't have to. So normally I never use those things.
Right.
I have them.
Yeah.
And I would use them if it was necessary, but I try to avoid that.
Yeah.
So if the vocalist, even with one of what those call pop filters, and they can also be a foam thing that fits over the microphone, same idea. If that's not solving the problem, then the next step would be to try a different microphone, one that was less sensitive to it. Or maybe angling the mic so it's still aimed at their mouth, but not directly in front of it. And that way you can minimize the pops and other sounds.
And can the vocalist also minimize that sound? I feel like I can say something really hard like P, pop, and it does it, but I can also change the enunciation just a little bit to not put my lips together quite that hard and say P, pop. Like I don't, I don't sort of hold on to the beginning P.
Right. Yeah. On, what was it, Bottom of the Barrel?
Yeah, because that's got some really serious ones.
Yeah. And you did pop the mic a couple of times.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, all right, how are we going to solve this problem? Because
Yeah.
I didn't want to interfere with your
Yeah.
performance. But you said, oh, I think I can do that.
Right.
And you solved the problem.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it's more powerful that way.
Yes.
I think that performance worked better that way.
Yeah.
Even though you were trying very carefully not to pop the
Yes.
mic, there was just something about the character of your, when you said, pray,
Yeah.
that just sounded more.
Yeah. It was more intimate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
And we talked a little bit about those S sounds, the sibilants.
Mm-hmm.
Ribbon mics are great because they don't have that boosted high end, so it doesn't tend to be sibilant. So that's one way of solving the problem. But sometimes, you get a great performance on a condenser mic and it sounds terrific, but it's just too sibilant. Mm-hmm. So there's actually devices that they can use in the studio, either as a piece of hardware or a computer-generated processing thing that will actually be sensitive to those S's. And when it hears one, it drops the level of it.
Okay.
And they call them de-essers.
Oh, okay. I've never heard of that.
Yeah. So that's another way around it. There's a lot of different ways you can approach recording. You could do something where you had all the performers in the room all together, singing and playing simultaneously, basically doing a performance that you record. And you could record that using one omnidirectional microphone in the middle of them if you wanted to, or individual microphones. But if you wanted to have the ability to do different things to those sounds, not only adjust their balance, but if you wanted to, enhance the sound of it or modify the sound of it in some way, which we'll talk about coming up. But that requires that the sound that each microphone is picking up is pretty well isolated from all the other sounds. It's never perfect, but you can do that to the extent that you have that kind of control over it with some limitations. So that's one way of recording. Another way might be to record the basic rhythm instruments, the kind of thing that we do on your songs, where generally we have drums, cello, and guitar that we're going to use, but they're all performing at the same time. Mm-hmm. And you're singing and playing, but isolated from them in a different room.
Yes.
The idea is that we can get the performance that you need while still keeping that kind of isolation. Because, you sing loud. Mm-hmm. And banjo's loud,
yes.
which I don't think are unrelated.
Right. They're not unrelated.
Yeah. So we have to take some steps to do that. But I also like to be able to, with any vocalist, but with you especially, to give them the opportunity to record their instrument separately, mm-hmm. so they can put their full concentration into that.
Yes.
And then do the vocal separately.
Yes.
You can put your full concentration on the vocal performance.
Yes.
So there's lots of different approaches to doing that. Part of the challenge for any recording session like that is being able to foresee where the potential problems are with isolating instruments from each other, mm-hmm. and how much of that is going to be a difficult problem to solve later, and how is that going to affect the overall sound of the recording. That's why, for a lot of people, the approach is simple, particularly if they're a multi-instrumentalist that records their own music and they do all the parts, or maybe with a couple of other people, but basically it's just them.
Yeah.
They have to do each of those parts separately. And because they're done separately, they're complete isolation because you don't have any other instruments going at the same time.
Do you feel like that you can feel that when someone has done it that way?
Well, I think it certainly has the potential to ruin the feel of the recording.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's something that happens when you put a bunch of musicians in a room. There's synergy. It's just way more than the individual parts at that point.
Yes.
And I always want to capture that. So my approach is always to record as much of it simultaneously as I can.
Yeah.
You know, it may be that at some point we have something that you do that we decide we're just going to do it all at once and just get the isolation we need however we have to.
Right.
But so far, I think it's been pretty successful the way we've been doing it.
It's been great. And I still have the feeling of connection, even though I'm in a separate space and separate room. So
yeah,
I'm still there.
Yeah, one of the problems here in this studio is you can't see each other.
Mm-hmm. True.
And that's a problem. So ideally, it would be a situation where you can see the other players and they can see you. Because I think there's a lot that goes on.
Agreed.
Communications-wise between people. So this is a sort of an artificial situation, not ideal.
Right.
In this case, a window between the two spaces is practical. An alternative solution would be to use video monitors, so at least you can see each other. Yeah. Ian, who does my assistant engineer on everything, he has some experience setting up systems like that, so that we may do that at some point. One of the other things is that if you have really good isolation between the instruments, if somebody makes a mistake, it doesn't ruin the whole thing.
Right.
Because we can go back and replace their part.
Right.
But if there's some of their part that's bleeding into other microphones, you have to make a decision. Is that going to be too much? If they're just replacing an identical part, it may be fine. It may just sound like there's a little extra room component to their sound. But if it's a solo or something which will probably be totally different every time,
right,
you can't do that.
Yeah.
So they almost always have to be recorded either with really superb isolation or done at a different time. The way we isolate instruments from each other as much as possible is by using microphones with different characteristics to reject the sound of the other instruments. And we can move them as far apart as possible, and we can use some sort of thing that separates the two sounds that we're if we're dealing with two sounds, trying to isolate them from each other. The way we do that here is I use things that are variously called baffles or gobos, which I think is really a term from the film industry, but is used sometimes. And that way we can eliminate some of the direct sound. So when I'm recording, our people for the tracks all at once, I have various ways of putting things in between them all to minimize that kind of sound.
Yeah.
And it's not perfect isolation. So most of the time when I do that, there's really not a good option of replacing the cello part or replacing the guitar part. But by keeping them as isolated as possible, it does give me more versatility in individually working with those sounds that I couldn't have otherwise. One other aspect of that isolation situation is, do we really need to totally isolate them from each other? And a lot of times, for me, the answer is no. That when you can hear some of the drums in the cello mic, it does something to fill out the sound of the drums.
Right.
And same thing with the guitar microphones.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be 100% isolation, but it is something that whoever's doing the recording has to take into account.
Right.
Just to give them, the best possible working material at that point. All right, so I think we've covered microphones in a lot of detail.
Yes.
And how we use them and why. But from your perspective, the microphone is there in front of you, and it goes through a wire into the wall someplace.
Right.
And then it becomes kind of mysterious.
Yes.
What's your notion of what happens to that after it leaves the studio part?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have a really basic understanding, and it may not all be true. I know that you guys are in there listening to what's being recorded and possibly hearing things that maybe are too brash, too loud, too quiet, picking up anything like that. And while you're doing that, you're doing what I call mixing, I guess, which is tuning the levels, making the microphone louder, maybe getting rid of any reverb that doesn't belong there, deciding if the isolation is a problem, deciding if I'm playing too loud, and then trying to adjust levels in some way to make it sound its very best, and that it all goes together and with all the instruments that are playing at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good perspective on it. It's, at that stage of the recording, you're not doing that much mixing. Mm-hmm. Things, in my mind anyway, things fit together a certain way. Mm-hmm. And I've just been doing it for so long that I just know. Mm-hmm. I mean, I probably know before we even start recording, I can set those levels where I know that they're going to need to be, just to give us a starting point that may not even be changed, maybe good enough, but it could be changed. But we're not making decisions on the balance between the instruments at that point. That's for further down the road.
Okay.
So the main purpose at that stage is just to make sure that we capture everything right and that the performance is right and that there aren't any mistakes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes mistakes you just miss. Mm-hmm. I mean, I prefer to be in a control room with nobody else in there during that part of it because I really have to focus on that just to make sure that nothing goes wrong. Because, as you know, when we do your recordings, just because of the nature of it, everybody has to travel and everybody's really, really busy.
Yes.
So we have to get a lot done in a day.
Yes.
It's not practical in most cases to say, oh, I didn't realize he made a mistake there.
Right.
So we have to make sure we get it captured properly from the beginning. And oftentimes, if that happens, I won't say anything because there's no point in pointing out mistakes to people.
Right.
There's no value in that.
Yeah. Yes.
Unless they're making the same mistake over and over. And then obviously there's some problem with their concept of the song or whatever. But that doesn't happen with the people we're working with.
Right.
I'll just say, let's do another one. Mm-hmm. In some recording situations, people will say, well, we'll do 6 takes, 10 takes, 20 takes, and then we'll edit all those together so we have one perfect performance.
Oh, wow.
That's a legitimate approach, and people make good records doing it that way. I don't like doing that.
Yeah.
I really don't. I'd much prefer to have this sort of cohesive beginning to end performance. And if there's imperfections in there, that may be okay.
Yeah, that's the human part of what we're doing.
Right. So I'm not overly concerned about little minor problems. Mm-hmm. For example, there's times when, the guitar player doesn't play the chord exactly right. His fingering is a little off. So there may be one string in the chord that isn't right.
Yes. And
sometimes that's like, oh, that's bad. Mm-hmm. Other times you just say, I can live with that.
Right.
And those are the kinds of decisions you have to make at that stage.
Right.
Whether that's acceptable or that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Or if the drummer, while he's playing, hits the sticks together, which happens, fairly frequently because they're busy.
Right.
There's a lot going on, especially if they're doing some sort of fill using multiple drums and cymbals and stuff.
Right.
They may hit the sticks together, which are out of time with everything.
Right.
And you have to decide, is that a problem that we can live with or not?
Yeah.
So those are those kinds of decisions that are made at that stage. But the primary purpose at this point in the recording is just make sure everything's captured properly. All right. If after all this discussion, if there's anybody out there, and I'm sure they are, that want to hear your music, how can they hear it?
They could go to my website, which is CorrieLynnGreenmusic.com, Corrie. That's how you spell my name. You can find the songs. The whole album is on Bandcamp under the same name, Corrie Lynn Green. You can find it on all streaming services as well. Yeah, and we sure hope you check it out. We worked really hard on it. It's a beautiful album, and it's something really different.
Great. Well, Corrie, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our conversation went on to cover many other topics, which will be available in subsequent episodes. In Part 2, we talk about headphones and how they can affect a performance, what happens to the microphone signal after it leaves the studio and gets to the control room. We discuss consoles, mic preamps, and digital recorders, mixing and sound manipulation, loudness and what it means, and reduced file size formats like MP3 and how best to use those files. I am sure you know people who could benefit from this information. Please direct them to this podcast and share it on your social media. Thanks. You can reach me at dwfern@dwfern.com. Let me know if you found this episode useful. This is my take on music recording. I'm Doug Fern. See you next time.